Okay, so take a look then. 13.5, number 1. So finishing up 13.4, we talked a little bit about graphing your sign in your calculator. If you haven't looked at 13.4, number 7 video, that'd be a good idea to take a look at that to see how to set up your window and make your signs and in this case cosines fit into your calculator. So here we're given a window that's on your calculator, and we are going to start to find the period of the function. We're going to find amplitude. We're going to find the x values of the maximum, minimum, and then the x values for the 0. So we're going to find all those on the little picture there. This off to the right here, this is representing the window. So again, if you look back at 13.4 number 7, I talked a lot about how to set up your window with a x min, x max, your scale, y min, y max, and then your scale of how you count. So we're going to use this to read what this window is telling us. So find the period and the amplitude of each cosine function. Determine the values of the x between 0 and 2 pi, where the maximum levels and minimum levels and zeros occur. So let's start by looking at this window. So the window says my x min is negative 2 pi. So that means that this value way to the left on my screen is negative 2 pi. So that's my x-axis, and I gotta put that negative sign there. And then this is going to be 2 pi. So it's really showing us 4 pi of this cosine curve. So it's showing us negative 2 pi to 0, which is 2 pi, and then 0 to 2 pi, which is another 2 pi. So we're seeing 4 pi total. Then it's also showing us that the maximum is 4, and the minimum down here is negative 4. And then we're counting by 1. So that means that this is negative 3, this is negative 2, this is negative 1, so on and so forth. We're counting by 1s. That's what that scale is telling us. So you're going to want to get yourself familiar with your calculator, how to set up your window so that you can read these graphs. Now let's look at the period. So the period represents the length of one cycle. So this cosine function, just like we talked about in the previous video, it starts at the highest point, the maximum, then it's going to go down to the minimum, and then it's going to come back up and finish back at the maximum again. So there would be one complete cycle, which is equal to the period. So that tells me that my period is 2 pi. So there's going to be my period, and I can just find a maximum point and then distance that out till I get to the next maximum. It takes 2 pi units to do that. The amplitude is my highest and lowest point. So my amplitude here is 3 to negative 3. So that means I have an amplitude of 3. So our graph, I call the x-axis, or that theta axis, is just kind of the median. It's splitting that graph in half. So it goes from 3 to negative 3. That means my amplitude is 3. Next, we're going to find the x values for the maximum and minimum. Now, one thing to keep in mind is it is telling us just for 0 to 2 pi. So determine the values of x for 0 to 2 pi, where the maximum, minimum, and zeros occur. So I'm going to kind of cut off my screen here. I'm only looking at this window right here. So where are my max, min, and zeros from 0 to 2 pi? So I'm not worried about anything on this side. So all the stuff over there, I'm not worried about any of those. So let's start with the maximum. So I'm looking at what is the x value for the maximum of this cosine function? Well, right here is one of my maximums, right there. And it occurs right where theta is equal to 0. So my x equals 0, there's one of my maximums. The next maximum doesn't occur until I get to the very end of my cosine function over here. And that is happening at 2 pi. So my x value of 0 is a maximum. My x value of 2 pi is a maximum. And I'm getting those from the x-axis, or the theta axis down here. That's where I'm getting those answers. Now the minimum. There's only one minimum. There it is. And that occurs at the middle point. So between 0 and 2 pi, where is the exact middle between 0 and 2 pi? Right at pi. So that minimum occurs at pi. And then lastly, the x values for the zeros. So I'm looking at where does this graph cross the x-axis right here, and it crosses right here. Well, this point right here is between 0 and pi. Well, halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2. So there's one of my zeros. And the other between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2. Now, all of these just relate back to the unit circle. So these are all your values from the unit circle. So at 0, that's a maximum. That's where the cosine is equal to 1. 2 pi, that's a maximum. Minimum pi, that's where you're way on the left side of your unit circle. That's where x is the smallest. And then your x values for the zeros are pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Heading on to our second picture. So just some things to keep in mind. This one's going from negative 2 pi to 2 pi again. So keep that in mind. That's what we're talking about, from negative 2 pi to 2 pi. And we're going to find the period. So the period is the length again of one cycle. So let's change to blue again. So one cycle goes here, goes down, comes back up. There's one cycle. Now that goes right in between 0 and 2 pi. That's where it ends. So this one has a period of pi. You could also do your period is going to be 2 pi over b. And remember, 2 pi over b represents the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. Well, this one has 2 cycles between 0 and 2 pi, so that would be 2 pi over 2, which simplifies down to pi. So either way, you're going to get pi. So this just I use the picture just to find one cycle. So that goes right to this point right in the middle here, which represents pi. That's that number right there. Next is your amplitude. Looking at your y-axis, you've got a positive 2 to negative 2, and you're counting by ones. So that tells us that our amplitude is 1. Here's your highest and lowest point. The x values for the maximum. So we got a couple more maximums here. We've got a maximum at 0. We got a maximum at pi, and we've got a maximum at 2 pi. So there's your maximum. So 0, pi, and 2 pi all include my maximums. And again, I'm just looking between 0 and 2 pi. So I'm just going to kind of cut off the rest of the graph, not looking at anything in the negative side, just 0 to 2 pi. Where's my maximums? Then my minimums, lowest points right here and right here. Well, between 0 and pi, halfway between 0 and pi is pi over 2, just using fractions. And between 0 and, pi and 2 pi, that's going to be 3 pi over 2. And those are the only two minimums. Now we get to the zeros. So where does it cross that x-axis? And let's use purple here, change up the color. So zeros are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this point right here was pi over 2. You got to ask yourself, that's like 1/2. What is half of pi over 2, or what's half of a half? Well, that would be a 4th. So that means that this point where that 0 is occurring right here, that is going to be pi over 4. So one of my zeros is pi over 4. Then this next interval, that's pi over 2, or that would be considered 2 pi over 4. The next 0 then is 3 pi over 4. I'm just counting by pi's over 4. Or if you like to think of it as fractions, we're just counting by 1/4. After 3 pi over 4, it'd be 4 pi over 4. Well, 4 pi over 4 is just pi, because 4 over 4 is just 1. This next 0 right here is going to be 5 pi over 4. And 6 pi over 4 would be the next interval. Right here would be 6 pi over 4, which was 3 pi over 2. And then we get to 7 pi over 4. So we're counting by pi over 4. You're counting by 1/4 to find all of those zeros. So there would be your zeros where it crosses the x-axis of all of your points.